Hello everyone and welcome back to TJ Economics, where today we're going to be looking at consumer and producer surplus, a year 12 microeconomics topic, and indeed how you can use it to add marks to your analysis and your evaluation. So at its most basic level then, consumer and producer surplus are merely just a measure of welfare in a market. There is specific definitions, but at its most basic level, it is just a measure of welfare. So, for example, consumer surplus is the difference between the price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and what they actually pay, whereas producer surplus is the difference between the price a producer would sell a good for and what they actually sell it for. So, for example, if I go into a shop and I would like to buy a Yorkie, and the Yorkie is £1, but I would be willing to pay £1.25 for it, that means that I have consumer surplus of 25p because I would be willing to pay 25p more. And so you can see I would have welfare, I would have a benefit because I'm willing to pay more than what I actually pay for it. Likewise, we can look at producer surplus. Maybe Nestle, the company that makes Yorkies, it costs, they sell it for £1, but they would be willing to sell it for 60p. That means they have a producer surplus of 40p, because that is the difference between what they are willing to sell it at, 60p, and what they actually receive, £1. So they have 40 pence of producer surplus. So we can actually show it on a diagram. So we have price and quantity, we have demand and supply, we have our equilibrium P star Q star. And so with points on a diagram, with points A, B and C, we can actually show that consumer surplus is equal to that green triangle area A, B, P star. Why is that? Well, the demand curve shows us how much consumers are willing to pay for a good or service, and then the price, P star, is what they are actually paying, the market price. And so the difference between that demand curve and the price is consumer surplus. Likewise, the supply curve shows us what suppliers will be willing to supply it for, and then the market price. So that orange triangle, C, B, P star, is producer surplus. That's the difference between the market price, P star, and the price they'd actually get, or, well, that they'd be willing to sell it for. So we can use consumer surplus then to measure the impact of a policy or something on consumers. For example, if consumer surplus gets smaller, we can say that consumers are worse off because they have smaller surplus and therefore smaller welfare. Likewise, we can do the same for producers too. So a change in producer surplus means that producers are better or worse off. Again, let's look at this on a diagram. So we go back to this diagram. We looked at this before. We've got the green triangle of consumer surplus and the orange triangle of producer surplus. So what we can see is that, say, for example, we were to levy an indirect tax on the production of this thing. Maybe it's VAT, smoking tax, alcohol tax, or even a Yorkie tax. What would that do? Well, we would see that the supply curve shifts inwards. And we can see that the price the consumer pays goes up to P2, whereas the price the producer receives drops to P3. And this will impact on surplus. As you can see in the table on the right, we've got consumer surplus, producer surplus before the tax. And before the tax, obviously, the government gets no revenue because they're not levying a tax. And there is no welfare loss because we're at equilibrium. But when we levy the tax, look what happens. The green consumer surplus triangle shrinks to ADP2, and the orange producer surplus triangle shrinks to CEP3. So they are much smaller. But look as well, we've got that blue box of government revenue, P2DEP3, and we've also got that purple triangle of welfare loss, DBE. And so we can say that consumer surplus and producer surplus are now smaller due to the tax. And that is what we should expect, right? After a tax on a product, we should expect that consumers are worse off because they're paying a higher price and they're buying less of it. Likewise, producers are worse off because they are receiving a lower price and they're making less. And so the producer and consumer surpluses are smaller. The government revenue box, though, that's obviously bigger. It goes from nothing to that blue box. That means government revenue has grown, but there's also welfare loss that has grown. That purple triangle represents consumer and producer surplus that has been lost. That means that the consumers don't have it, The producers don't have it and the government don't have it. No one has that welfare. It has disappeared. And so that is inefficiency in the market because we have forced that welfare to be lost. No one has it. And so overall market welfare has fallen, even though the government have gained. And so we can use this in our analysis in a chain of reasoning. For example, due to the increase in indirect tax, this means that costs of production will rise for firms, and as a result, supply will shift inwards from supply to supply plus tax. As a result, the price that consumers pay will rise from P1 to P2, and they will consume less of it from Q1 to Q2. Likewise, the price firms receive is now lower at P3, so they produce less as well. Because price is now higher at P2, consumers lose out, and their consumer surplus is reduced from ABP1 to ADP2. Additionally, producer surplus falls from CBP1 to CEP3. Despite the loss of consumer and producer surplus, the government does gain tax revenue equal to P2DEP3, but welfare is also lost in the market, equal to the area DBE. So you can see here, in an essay, we can use the diagram, we can use our chains of reasoning to describe the impacts. So for example, what are the negative impacts of an indirect tax? We can look at specific stakeholders. So consumers, firms, the market and the government. The stakeholder of the consumer is worse off because of the tax, because they have less consumer surplus. The firm is worse off. How do we know that? Because they have less producer surplus. And the market is worse off because we have created deadweight loss, that purple triangle. So we have three stakeholders that have lost out. However, the government has gained. They've gained the tax revenue P2, DEP3. And so they have gained. And so in your essays, you can speak about specific different stakeholders, consumers, firms, the government and the market, to analyse whether a policy is good or bad. Who does it benefit? Who does it have a negative impact on? You know, for a subsidy, it would be different. For a minimum and maximum price, it would be different. It would depend on the elasticities. But as long as we can identify and then use chains of reasoning that involve consumer surplus, you're going to be onto a winner. So a summary then. Consumer and producer surpluses can be very useful in analysis and evaluation. It can tell us who gains or who loses out due to certain policies. For example, as we saw, with an indirect tax, we see that consumers and producers lose welfare to the government, whilst there is also deadweight welfare loss in the market. This, when used properly, can add depth to your analysis and evaluation, which you might well be lacking. This is because you can fully describe the impact of microeconomic policies on different stakeholders. That is how you add depth to your analysis and evaluation. Speak specifically about specific stakeholders and what the impact is on them in the diagram. So, hopefully you enjoyed today's video, you found it useful. Please do drop a like, subscribe and hit the bell if you have. You can follow me on Instagram as well, or Twitter X if you would like to follow me there as well. And please do keep your eyes peeled for more videos coming soon. See you next time.